This is Trader's Workshop with Adam H. Grimes. Hello, and welcome to episode 22 of Trader's Workshop, Music and Markets. I'm your host, Adam Grimes. You can find more of my work on my blog, adamhgrimes.com, and go follow me on Twitter at AdamHGrimes. I publish a lot of things in a lot of different places, and you'll pretty much see everything come through Twitter. So if you follow me on Twitter at AdamHGrimes, you won't miss anything. Okay, so this topic, the first time somebody asked me to speak about the connection between financial markets and music was over 20 years ago. I've avoided this topic very carefully, actually, because I've thought so much about it. There's so much interest. People keep asking. Over the past few months, I had 3 requests for this topic. It's a fascinating topic, but the thing that has scared me about it is it's frankly very easy to say things that are superficial. It's very easy to draw all of these nebulous connections, and some of them might be very interesting. Some of them might even have a seed of truth. But it is much more difficult to say things that are true. And it's extremely difficult to say things that are true and useful. And I feel this is because both of these topics are such an important part of my life. Frankly, I haven't been sure I could do this topic justice, but I'm going to try today. So finally, after a couple decades, we'll just close our eyes and jump and see what happens. A little bit of my bio, if you don't know, and I don't want to talk too much about this, but my first career, I was a musician. My formal training, I was a classical musician, a composer, a pianist. This means that I was not a normal kid. I spent in high school many times 6 to 8 hours a day, which then continued through college, pursuing various aspects of music. And when I got to college, I was able to, I went to a pretty decent school, and basically I avoided taking a bunch of the music classes because I'd already learned myself in high school. And how did I do that? Well, I think that's where things start to get interesting. This topic today we're going to cover in kind of 2 broad categories. First of all, we're going to look at the connections that people think exist between music and markets. And I think you're probably going to be a little unsatisfied. I'm going to largely debunk many of those. And I do that from a position of pretty deep understanding of both topics, I hope. The second, though, is where things get very interesting. I think what allowed me to basically opt out of a lot of my college coursework, the tools and techniques that I had learned to develop those skills and to learn the body of knowledge, to organize the body of knowledge, I think that connects very clearly to the idea of learning to trade and learning to understand financial markets. I think that's where the gold is buried. But let's start first of all with these connections. And I think every now and then, I'll get a question. People will say, do you think if somebody's a great musician, they're going to be good at trading? And there are all of these articles kind of circling around that show that music training leads to, or is let's be careful, right? Let's say is correlated with success in a wide number of fields. And what I think counterbalancing that, what we're beginning to realize very clearly is that expertise is very domain specific. So in other words, if I become let's just talk about different things. If I become a good musician, I'm going to be good at music. And then to assume that I'm automatically going to be good at math or military strategy would be naive. Even though we think there might be connections between some of these things. Another connection, if I study chess deeply and become a skilled chess player, does not necessarily mean that I will then be any better at law, at math, or at military strategy for that matter. I'll be good at chess. You will be good at where you spend your time. And this is such an important thing, right? Because we all have 24 hours in the day. We all have the same number of years, give or take, that will be here on this planet. And you've got all of these other things you have to do. And you only have so much free time. You only have so much time that you can direct toward honing a skill and a craft. And that's why I think it's very important to have focus and to choose to pursue excellence very carefully. And that's what we'll get into in a moment. But the idea about skills transferring between domains, I don't think that's true. And I don't know that, but I do know that more and more the research that's being done seems to support that idea, that it's not necessarily, these connections don't really exist quite that easily. But now we're talking about the connections between financial markets and music. And one of the connections that I think is real is this idea of patterns. And if you look at music is built from relatively simple patterns. And I'm sitting at a keyboard here, and I'll just play a scale. So those notes can be rearranged, put together in a lot of different ways, beginning in very simple units. So one thing we might do if we play several notes together, we get chords. And a chord is nothing more than 3 or more notes sounded together. And we find that there are certain connections between certain chords. Do you hear that second chord kind of brings us back to the first? If I play this, your ear probably automatically provides that resolution, right? And that particular sequence of chords, we could add another one. Very basic stuff, but that is the core for pretty much most of the music most of us experience. It's certainly the common language of most pre-1900 classical music. So this is Bach and Beethoven and Brahms, even Rachmaninoff, which is not pre-1900. It's certainly the basis for jazz and blues. Just those 3 chords, rock and roll, and by extension, most of the popular music, country, western, a tremendous proportion of the music you listen to. And unless you are into some kind of far out there music, you might even be able to say all the music you listen to is based on those 3 chords and then some variations. And we see the same thing in markets, because price changes in markets are driven by buying and selling. But there are really only so many ways this can happen in financial markets. If you think about it, you can have buyers and sellers in relative equilibrium. You can have, let's just assume buyers are going to win here. You can have buyers more strongly motivated. And people will say more buyers than sellers. That's not necessarily true, of course. You have a very motivated buyer, and that buyer or buyers will buy in many different ways, but really it comes down to a few things, right? If the buyer really, really, really wants to buy, he or she will just push the price like crazy. If you can imagine a relatively quiet market, which is the condition where things are pretty much in balance, and then somebody comes in and buys very, very aggressively, and the thing just spikes without looking back. That's one kind of buying. What's another kind of buying? Where they'll buy a little bit and then pause, and then buy a little bit more and then pause. And you really have these very simple behaviors in markets that fit together to create all of the complexity that we see, and all of the complexity masked in the behavioral context and in the context of human emotion, randomness. All of these things come together really from very simple actions in the market. And I think that is that useful? And you see now why I haven't done this topic, because I don't really think that I've told you anything that's very useful. I can remember a recent discussion I had with somebody who had kind of built himself up as an expert on the topic of music and markets in an online group. And this guy was a guitar player, played blues and some rock guitar. And he told me, he said, you know, the chart of the S&P 500 is exactly like the Moonlight Sonata. And I said, well, that's quite interesting, but what do you mean? And he said, well, if you don't see it, I can't tell you about it. And this is where, when people are telling you things that aren't quite true, particularly in trading, I think, it kind of falls into that, right? And he said to me, well, you know, if you don't understand it, you're just never going to understand it. And I said, well, you know, maybe we can talk about this a little bit, because I probably think it's fair to say I've seen at least as much action in the S&P 500 as you have, and I'm willing to bet that I know the Beethoven sonatas. I didn't say this to him, but you know, obviously I know the 32 Beethoven sonatas probably a lot better than you do, and you've probably heard the Moonlight Sonata a few times on the internet or something, YouTube, right? And when we dug into it a little bit more, you know, what are you talking about? Are you talking about the rhythm? Are you talking about the melody? Are you talking about the melodic rhythm, the harmonic rhythm? Are you talking about the structure? Are you talking about the proportion? Are you talking about form? Are you talking about, by the way, the first movement, second movement, or the third movement? Are you talking about the relationship? Like, what are you talking about? And what are you talking about with the market? Are we, you know, and it turned out that he just thought the Moonlight Sonata kind of went up and then down, and so did the S&P. That's not really useful either. So I think if you, and I know why do I say that? Not really to pick on that guy, though it was kind of a frustrating conversation. Turned out I wasted an hour of my life speaking with somebody who knew absolutely nothing. That's okay. So yeah, I guess a little bitter. But because I think that there are all of these tantalizing connections that people hold out that I just don't think are really there. However, this idea of the complexity being built up from very simple units, and probably nobody does this, at least the music that we still play and talk about, nobody does this as clearly as Bach. And if you want to experience this type, the Bach will do things very blatantly, like we'll take a pattern and then we'll play it in shorter note values, longer note values, we'll turn it upside down, we'll play it backwards. That's a very structured compositional technique that you might not always experience, but I think it does, we could find some parallels where things like that happen with basic formations, fractal formations in the market, units of price action, if you will. But I really don't know what that would get us. That doesn't seem to be that useful. And then there's also this idea of deep structure. I told you I'm going to be on a debunking mission here at first. And I've written about this. Many of you who know my work know that I am, let's just say, unrelentingly critical of Fibonacci ratios, simply because they don't show up in the market data. Like it's not really something that I see there. And also, by the way, I managed to trade pretty well without them, so you don't need them. There's also this idea, and if I look at the history of my trading, you know those moments where you really want to hit yourself in the head very hard? I spent some of my early years playing with Fibonacci ratios and trading, and I had already fought that same battle in music. There are people who will tell you that Fibonacci ratios are very important in music, and then I will shortcut this, but when you really get down into it, you see that that's not true. It's not true in any reliable way. The idea would be that something important happens in a piece of music at certain structural ratios. Well, how do you define those ratios? Is it the amount of time? Which seems to me that would be really the only way to do it, right? If I play a piece of music and it's 10 minutes long, then I probably should be able to look at those on the timeline, the temporal relationships, because where it is on the page might not be so significant. If you don't read music, you might not realize it, but that you might have half a page of music that takes 5 seconds to play, or you might have half a page of music that takes 2 minutes to play, and both of those are extremes. But just to illustrate the point that physical space on the page, or even number of notes, does not necessarily relate to the experience of music, which is in time. And so you can look at it a lot of ways. And I did. I'm certain I spent hundreds of hours really looking at works from various composers with all the supposed Fibonacci connections. And I even talked to people who were experts in the field, and just like you will find when you think critically about Fibonacci and trading, the answers were very unsatisfying. One of the people who had written a paper about Fibonacci relations in one of the Beethoven sonatas was relying on measuring inches on the page. And I have here in my office 4 different editions of the Beethoven sonatas, and they're all printed differently. So you'd really have to carefully pick the edition that you want, or at least maybe go back to the manuscript. And this is even more interesting in music, by the way. Here's a music-specific thing, because we know composers played games with numerology and symbolism. We know that, again, to go back to Bach, that there are places where he actually draws pictures in the notes. There's in one of the choral pieces, there are places where on the page he has drawn Christian crosses in notes. I don't mean he actually drew, but like it's in the printed music. There are also, Bach would sign his name in musical notes, and other composers certainly have done things like that. But I think with Bach, it's easier to see because all this stuff is a little bit closer to the surface sometimes. And we know that different keys, different connections of keys had different meanings for composers, but even them, like all of this deep structure that people think exists in connection to these magical ratios in music, I, as a composer and musician, pretty much came to the conclusion that it wasn't nearly as valuable or as real as people thought. And then fast forward a few years, I find myself jumping with both feet down the same rabbit hole with trading and having to take a few years to dig myself out of it again. And the last connection here, I think, before we get into learning techniques, is that one of the things I say to people all the time is the chart is not the market. And that seems, depending on your perspective, that may seem like a very basic thing. Well, of course the chart is not the market, but it's very easy to forget that. It's very easy when we spend so much of our lives looking at patterns on the page or on the screen that we begin to think these candlesticks are the market, but they're not. And in fact, your candlestick is dividing the market into daily periods or into 5-minute periods or hourly periods, or your bar chart or your Renko chart, whatever chart you're using. I would even ask the question, are those time units the market even really knows? Maybe daily bars, we could say yes, but a daily bar in currencies that closes at the New York time, at the New York close, is that really what that market knows? Or a futures market where the pit closes and then the market continues to trade and you get your daily close with stocks on the bar? Or imagine, what's an 11-minute bar, a 13-minute bar? Is that something the market really knows? We can do anything like that. Or number of ticks or volume bars. It's necessary. I'm not saying charts are bad. In fact, I'm a huge advocate for charts. I'm a huge advocate for all of the things that we can do and see, and the ways that charts can help us to process the market data. But we need to remember that what we're doing is looking at a representation of the market. The chart is not the market. And the same thing, the printed music is not the experience of music. If you think about it, well, I mean, it's good and bad, but we're swamped in music today. You can't go anywhere without hearing music. In fact, one of the things I do in my office, if you listen for a moment, you'll hear it silent. This is the middle of the day. I'm recording this after lunch. And I never have on background music. I never have on the television for noise. I create an environment of silence, except for my audio alerts on my market data, so I know when the market makes a new high or low. We kind of we take music for granted. It's so much a part of our experience, but it's really a profound thing if you think about it. If you go back in history before we had recordings, imagine the fact that somebody can put dots on a page that were driven by emotion, among other things, right? And that we can see those dots on the page and then somehow create something that brings the experience that person who is long dust, by the way, that brings that experience that person was having into the now. That's a profound thing, and we take that for granted. But we're tempted to look at this book of music and say, this is music. It's not. It's a representation, just as the chart is a representation for the market. So here ends the first part of our podcast. Now, here's where I think things might get a little bit more practical, I hope. And let's talk about learning. How do you develop skills, and what connections are there? Let's frame it like this. The way we develop skills as a musician, what can we learn from those techniques that can help us to develop as traders? Let's frame it like that. And the first thing that I would tell you is it takes a long time. If you want to become a skilled classical musician on a I have to be careful what I say. Let's say on an instrument that is competitive. So we're talking, I guess, is there classical music for the ukulele? I don't know, but certainly the piano or the violin or something like that. Your time to be competent is measured in years, many years, not months. People talk about the 10,000 hours, which I think is also a misunderstanding. And practically, by the way, most classical musicians have much more than 10,000 hours, where if you start to add it up, it starts to look like 20,000 or more. So it's certainly, it's a little bit daunting, right? If you want to play for your own entertainment or amusement, if you want to play pop music, if you want to play even some kinds of jazz, you can have some degree of proficiency in a few years. But if you came to me and said, Adam, I've never touched a keyboard and I want to play Chopin etudes, how long is it going to take me? The answer is maybe if you can spend 2 to 3 to maybe 4 hours a day, maybe 10 years. And that's a little bit crazy, right? Who begins a project where you won't really have any measurable, you have success along the way, but you won't be anywhere near where you want to be inside of 10 years. And trading doesn't take that long, but there certainly is a long learning curve measured in years for trading, 3 to 5 years, I think. And I think somebody with the right guidance and the right framework might be able to shortcut that a little bit, but you're still looking at a couple years. And if you had somebody that had the right kind of supportive framework, an example might be a family member. Let's say your father was a very successful trader. Well, you probably will grow up learning the mental skills and the ways to think about trading that will let you cut off some of the learning curve. You probably also have somebody to smack you in the side of the head and to say, "What, you just did something stupid. Learn from that. Don't do it again." Metaphorically slap you in the head. Because the market will do that for you, but it's just a longer learning curve. So yeah, if you had the right kind of family or perhaps institutional support, this is why we are able to create some institutional frameworks that help people, you might be able to achieve some competence inside of 3 years, but then you have the issue of learning from the market. And for instance, this is being recorded in late 2018, and it's been about 10 years since we've seen a bear market. So a lot of people, I talked to a lot of people who are having success trading, but maybe they've started in the past 6 years or the past 4 years. And the intelligent among those people, and I'll go ahead and make a value judgment, they'll say things like, I get questions like this, I'm a little concerned because I'm making very consistent money, but I know I have not seen all of these possible market conditions. What do I do? My answer is Be patient, maintain that humility. As soon as you start telling people what a great trader you are, you're screwed. That's why I can't bring myself to do the kinds of like schlocky marketing that a lot of people do, where they say I'm the greatest trader ever, because as soon as you start thinking like that, you're doomed. So you maintain that sense of humility, that sense of openness from learning from the market, but you also expect, if you've traded very well in a bull market and then we go into a bear market, you're going to struggle. And it's a noble struggle. It's a natural struggle. It's a struggle that's going to lead you somewhere very, very productive, but you're going to have a rough time with that transition, and you must be prepared for that. You must expect that. So there is a long, long learning curve in both, and it takes time. And I will tell you one of the things, a little bit more of my biography here. I worked as a musician, taught, loved teaching, which is one reason why I teach trading, because I really genuinely enjoy the process of teaching and everything about it, from me structuring the information to seeing the lights come on for somebody and making a difference in somebody's life. And that's not touchy-feely, abstract. That is something that I find profoundly motivating. For about 10 years, I had nothing to do with music because I couldn't do it as a hobby. I had done it at a high level, and when I went to business school and focused exclusively on markets, people said to me, "Oh, you'll be able, music will be a great hobby for you." Well, no, because my brain was still just as critical, but I did not have the technique, and I didn't have the time to maintain the technique, and it would have been nothing but frustration. So I went through a period of about 10 years where I did nothing with music, which, yes, was a waste in some ways, but I think it was probably the right thing to do. And over the past few years, I've returned to music pretty actively. And I've gone through a process of rebuilding my technique, which we won't talk too much about that here, but suffice it to say that it was kind of a Karate Kid-like endeavor. Remember wax on, wax off? I went to a teacher and spent many, many months playing single notes. At first, it was just a single note. I had entire lessons where for an hour, I would just drop a finger on a key and get minute corrections over and over. And then we progressed to playing two notes, one note after another. And then we progressed to playing patterns of notes. And it was about 8 or 9 months of that before I actually played a piece of music. And I'm not advising anybody else do that, because I think I had to have a really special mindset to do that. Certainly a beginner can't do that, but it was transformative in my playing. Let's just say that. But I'm now struggling, just to be perfectly honest, with figuring out how to put all of this together in my life. In other words, how do I do all of the things I have to do throughout the day? How do I have time for some downtime? But also, I told you how much time it takes to develop musical skills. How do I find several hours a day pretty consistently? It does need to be consistent to develop these skills. And one of the tricks that I'm using to good effect is what I call the 5-minute trick. And this means the idea of sitting down and working for 2 hours, memorizing a movement from a Bach partita is a little bit overwhelming. So I'm not going to do that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to sit down, I'm going to commit to working for 5 minutes. And if my brain I'm going to work for 5 minutes. If my brain just can't focus, then I might just noodle and improvise for 5 minutes. But I'm going to play for 5 minutes. More often than not, this 5 minutes become 2 hours. And it's very common for somebody to go into the process of learning to trade and you're just gung-ho. You center your life around it. Nothing can stop you. A few months in, you're tired. It's kind of boring. You start to see the same things over and over, and it's very hard to maintain the motivation. This is one of the untalked about reasons why people fail. Well, when you get to that point, not if, when, you will get to that point. When you get to that point, use something like the 5-minute trick. Tell yourself, I'm just going to sit down. I'm going to spend a little bit of time looking at charts and spend a little bit of time reading. And by the way, the 5-minute trick, you give yourself complete permission to just do those 5 minutes and then walk away. It's not a failure, but it is a little bit of a trick that if you fail today, I said it's not a failure, I said failure, right? And so if you do 5 minutes today and then you come back tomorrow and you do 5 minutes, one of these days, very soon, you're going to find yourself engaged. Or you're going to walk away from your 5 minutes thinking about something you were doing, and it's going to still be in your head. Then when you come back to it tomorrow, you're going to want to do more than 5 minutes on it. I also use this trick, by the way, for writing blogs, for a number of things. I think this is a really, really, really good technique, and it's so simple, it's easy to overlook. That's worth the price of the podcast, which was free, so there you go. The other thing, so now we're into learning. The other thing is the importance of fundamental skills. You know, if I look at a piece of music and I have something like this, well, I don't have to think about every note in that arpeggio. What it is just a chord. It's the same chord I showed you earlier, broken up, because I have the basic skill of playing that pattern, because I have spent so many years of my life developing these basic technical patterns, and they're just under my fingers. And I can take a piece of music that I've never seen before, and for the most part, play it reasonably well, because I have these fundamental skills. Now, these fundamental skills, here's something kind of fun, might be, let me see how I say this. There's a degree, there's a foundation that is very, very easy to miss. I know many of you have had piano lessons at some point in your life. Are you aware that there are at least 3 different ways mechanically to push a piano key with your hand? Okay, think about this. Put your hand somewhere, maybe on your leg or on a desk, and just take your index finger, lift it up at that first knuckle, and push it down. So you'll be pushing the key, and if you then turn your hand over, so you see the same thing. So here, your finger is moving from that joint where it's attached to your hand. That's probably the natural way most people would think to push a piano key, right? Or to push any button if you were just going to use your hand. And by the way, isolating that joint, if you do that for decades, will give you all kinds of issues with carpal tunnel. So that's one of the basic ways that children are taught that turns out to be very harmful and wrong. There's another way. The other way is grasping. So if you imagine, hold your hand out and imagine you have like a big soft foam tube in your hand and then squeeze. So, or like you're squeezing a foam ball. Do you see what you're doing here? Here your fingers are pulling into the palm. Now turn your finger over and again make that same motion against your leg or against the table or the desk or wherever you are. And you will feel here that there's a friction against the fingertip while your finger pulls into your palm. What you're actually doing here compared to that first motion is you're using a different set of muscles. There are 2 ways. Quite different, completely different. And then the third one is put your hand there, and this time don't move your finger, but turn, like you're turning a doorknob, turn your whole wrist. And you see that motion too can bring your fingertip down into the key. Now, that's a very basic thing. It's a very subtle thing, but I guarantee you there are a number of people listening here who had years and years and years of piano lessons, and you've never thought about that. You've never thought about the many different ways. And some of these things happen kind of automatically, but some of them happen in very harmful ways. And having very fine motor control over these different ways of moving your fingers, that's not natural. It's not even moving your fingers. It's really moving your body to get the finger to move on the key. Think about that. And now think about my trading course. If you haven't taken it, you should. Go to marketlifetrading.com. There is and I have a number of premium services there, but there's also a massive free trading course. It's about 30 hours of video, hundreds of pages of PDF exercises, and many people have taken the course and skipped over the exercises because they don't understand. And you've heard in previous podcasts, we've talked with Alex about some of these. Alex has skipped some of the exercises because he doesn't see the point in looking at this relationship of bars. He doesn't see the point in writing down prices. He doesn't see the point in drawing charts. I'm picking on Alex, but this is true of many, many, many people who have been through the course. I have people who will say, hey, I'm really struggling. I had a guy today just said, I lost X $1,000 in the Indian stock market. Can you help me? And I said, well, I'm very busy, but the first and most important thing I could tell you was, have you been through my trading course? Yeah, I looked at it, but I skipped over the exercises. He actually told me that. And I said, well, what do you mean you looked at it? So yeah, you see where this is going. And very few people who succeed do so without really digging down into these very basic elements. I think that's true of any discipline. A mathematician can get pretty fascinated by addition. And it seems like such a basic thing. A child learns to do it, right? But it's a profound concept if you think about it. And I just told you, I spent most of a year dropping my hand on a piano key and worrying about a lot of tiny, tiny, tiny aspects of how my body was moving that most people are completely blind to. If you trade, you're going to focus on aspects of market behavior and of your behavior that most people are blind to. Do you see the connections here? And once you have these techniques, once they're a part of you, it's so much a natural part of your thinking. For instance, I never get into a trade and it goes to my first profit target and I think, gosh, I'm going to make so much money on this trade. I know I'm supposed to get out here, but instead, let me add to the trade. I would never do that. Why? Because understanding that what makes my trading consistent is taking consistent profits in the right place. It's such a fundamental part of the way I think about markets and I think about my trading that I would never do that. Now, I did it a lot in my past. It cost me a lot of money, so I learned the hard way. But there definitely are fundamental skills. And I think one of the things we can all do a better job of when it comes to teaching trading is articulating better what these fundamental skills are. One of the fundamental skills is chunking. Let's look at this in music. Here is the beginning, and I want to play a lot for you here, but here's the beginning of the second movement of the Bach B-flat major partita for keyboard, BWV 825. This is the second movement, the Allemande. I'll play just the beginning. Okay, so it was not the best performance ever. You just heard, I don't know what, maybe about 12, 15 seconds of music probably. But in my mind, there are only really three things there. Because what I am able to do, listen to the beginning. That is all a chord. And then I know there's a little extra note in there. Just one little extra note. Hear that? It's just a chord. And there's a different chord. What is this? It's the same thing I played for you before. I actually didn't plan that. This is just open on my keyboard, and I thought, okay, so I would use this to illustrate chunking. And then what happens next? So that basic chord structure is what is underneath this. Now let me see if I can actually play it for you. that complexity you hear, the musician's mental map is really just 1, 4, 5, 1. You number the chords. That's the way you think about it. And that certainly becomes the case with reading market action. And on a very basic level, trends and trading ranges. And again, that's why my trading course is structured like this, to give you those fundamental ways of looking at a price chart and saying, is this trending? Is it ranging? And then we can dig down in and we can look for things like momentum moves. We can look for consolidations. We can look for blow-offs. But it really becomes a matter of mapping out these fundamental elements. And this is one reason why this is a real thing, but people get misled with this when they start doing things like the word escapes me, but where you say, oh, this chart looks exactly like the 1928 stock market, where analogs is the word that people use, technical analogs, where you just put one chart on top of another. Well, of course, you're going to be able to find those similarities because the market action is built from these same little units, but it doesn't necessarily mean there's anything. If you understand that, you understand why it's so easy to create those charts and why they're so meaningless and why they are so poor. How would they possibly have anything predictive? It's just because all you're really doing are looking, if you have market action that's built up from these basic, 6, 7 elements, of course you're going to find cases where they line up. And then the other things, now we're talking about learning skills. And I was talking about chunking there for being a way to both, music specifically memorize, but with markets to categorize and to see what I would say is the essence of price action. I think another fundamental technique here is understanding to application. That is very, very important. And that, I told you, I think that is how I was able to learn so much music theory. I basically learned the entire body of common practice music theory before college. And the way I did it was by learning techniques and then writing. I was a composer, about writing pieces of music, so I was using it. So I was talking with the department head shortly after school started, and I said, I don't think I should have to take music theory. And he said, well, everybody takes music theory. And I said, well, give me a test, let me proficiency out of it. Of course, at that point, I didn't quite realize that colleges exist to take your money and sell you credit hours. I didn't understand how that game worked. But he said, well, there's no test. People don't proficiency it. And I said, well, I can. And one of the theory teachers came in and we were discussing. He asked me very arrogantly, he said, well, what's an augmented sixth? What's the function of an augmented sixth chord? Thinking that's a fairly advanced topic that he was thinking that this kid just out of high school couldn't answer. I said, well, of course, it's a dominant prep, but what do you want to talk about how we saw this chord that appeared in the Classic and Rococo through Brahms, through Wagner, probably pointed even from the 1700s, pointed toward the ultimate breakdown of tonality in the 20th century. That's what's really interesting about it. But if you're just asking functionally, of course, it belongs to the family of dominant preps. So I didn't take the first year of theory, and they did charge me for the second year, but I believe I took tests, but I did not attend classes, if you can figure out how that worked. But how was I able to do that? Not because I was superhuman, but because I was very passionately engaged in the subject. I was highly motivated emotionally and intellectually. I spent a heck of a lot of time, while other people were doing other things at the end of high school, I was writing music and studying music theory. You only have so many hours in the day. You can't be an expert at everything. That's the trade-off. But I think really what brought it together was this was not an abstract concept for me, because I learned about it and then I wrote multiple pieces of music using the technique. And same thing in trading, right? You can think, and some of these things, I don't really have answers. I think I have some interesting things here, but maybe some of you will be able to find better ways to apply this directly to trading than I have. Let me give you a couple, because I don't want to go on forever here, but let me give you a couple more techniques specific to music, and we can think about how to do this with trading. One of the issues is, how do you learn to play something fast? So that's the beginning of one of the Chopin etudes. So one of the ways that, if you go to YouTube, there are all these YouTube channels that teach you how to play piano pieces by rote. One of the pieces of advice you would get is to take something like that and learn to play it very slowly. Now, anybody could learn to play it slowly. Right? It might take a while, but you could learn to do that. And then what is typically suggested is you play it hundreds of times, gradually increasing the speed. And eventually the thinking is that because you don't notice it getting faster, I'm going to magically be able... It's kind of like the old idea about boiling a frog, right? If you put a frog in a cold pot of water and turn it up, the frog doesn't notice it's being boiled. It'd actually be a terrible way to kill a frog or a lobster, because it would, I would imagine that it would suffocate because you boil the oxygen out of the... Anyway, it doesn't work for cooking frogs, and it also doesn't work for music. Why? Because you can't see this, but watch. What a silly thing to say. I'm going to play this. Now, you can't see, but I'm playing this left hand with only 2 fingers. My hand looks absolutely stupid on the keyboard. Point is, I can do anything at a slow speed. But for me to play it fast, there's only really one way to do it. And if I do something wrong slowly and gradually increase the speed, I will hit a point where I can't play it any faster. And so that's the way the technique is commonly taught, is to increase the speed a little bit at a time. A better way for a beginner to learn that would be to, first of all, learn the pattern of notes and then just try to play it fast. And it's going to be an absolute wreck. It's going to be impossible. And here's yet another connection with music and trading. With both, we really kind of start at perfection, and yet there is no perfection, right? It's a paradox, but one of the things I say with trading is that everything has to be right. You know, what's more important? Money management, entries, exits, on and on and on, psychology, right? You know, which one of these is the most important thing? And people will like to tell you one is more important, but the reality is everything is important. And if something is wrong, you're going to lose money. And that's also one of the issues with classical music specifically, at least, is that the standard is pretty much perfection, like no wrong notes. You know, you can play, and in reality, we don't ever actually get there. But that's what we are both aspiring toward. And before we can even think about interpretation or finer issues, we start with having all of the notes right. Well, as a beginner, you know, you wouldn't be able to do that. But what you would be able to do is, there is a way where you can play it as a wreck at a fast speed, but learn from that motion and then go back to slow. So rather than boiling the frog, starting slowly and gradually ramping up the speed, what you can do is try it at the ultimate performance speed. And again, let me stress, it will be an unmitigated disaster. You stand no chance of doing it. But then play it very, very slowly. However, when you play it slowly, you're not doing something dumb like I'm doing here, where I'm just using 2 fingers. You're trying to use the motions that you can see yourself using at the fast speed, and then you jump back to fast, and then you jump back to slow. So you're making these rather large leaps in speed and difficulty instead of gradually ramping up. It's completely logical. The idea of slowly ramping up speed seems completely logical, but it just does not work mechanically. And there are plenty of people that have injuries. If you really persisted, what you would do rather quickly is cause possibly permanent damage to your hands and arms. That's what you're going to do before you magically break through some barrier with improper technique. Now, I thought about this a lot in terms of how do we relate that to trading, and I'll leave you with a question mark. I don't know. I would like you to think about it. There are a lot of smart people listening to this podcast, and a lot of smart people at different stages of development. So some of you might have some ideas for how that principle of working, basically the way I think about it is you're learning from mastery. Ultimately your own mastery. What you want to do is to be able to play that at speed, and rather than gradually stepping up to it, you're learning from that state of mastery. Maybe there's something to be done there with trading. One of the other things is to vary the pattern, and people have different perspectives on this, but you could do things like, let's use this Bach here that's open. Eventually you're going to play. But you can learn it in different rhythms would be one way to do it. So I'm doing long, short, and then you could do short, long. You could do groups of 2, long, long, short, short. Now, I think you can easily overdo this and spend a lot of time on it. You could do 1 long, 3 short. And there I'm repeating the beginning note. You could do a lot of different things. You could play different articulations. So there I'm playing a lot of short notes. But there's actually quite a bit of learning theory research that shows that this idea of varying a pattern is an effective way to learn, because it takes it and shapes it in a different way. It challenges your mind. It removes any sense of boredom. It makes something very familiar fresh again. Now, that's a very specific music thing, and it's something that if you do it too much in music, your results won't be good either. But what can we do like that with trading? I don't know. And perhaps nothing. These were some of the techniques that I thought about, that specifically this idea of, there are 3 things, right? The understanding and how important it is to have a theoretical structural understanding, but then to connect that to practice. This idea of learning from that state of mastery, and this idea of learning by varying, not necessarily making it more difficult. It's not the same thing as a sprinter putting weights on his legs or something like that. But I don't think of it like that. Or a batter putting weights on the bat for warm-up swings. I think of it as more of a mental technique to kind of turn it and to see things in a different way. And then last, everybody wants to be innovative, everybody wants to be creative, but that really only works and is only meaningful if you thoroughly understand the rules. So the first thing that you need to do, you can find your own way, and you can make your own way, and you can make something new and interesting, but you really need to do that from a very good understanding of what people have done before. And this is why learning some of the traditional orthodox ways to think, it's probably a good place to start, even if you intend to completely go your own way, or you hope to completely go your own way. So I hope that was interesting. I'm not really sure it was. I'm just going to publish this, and we'll see how it's received. I certainly welcome your thoughts and feedback and comments. And I would also like you, if you would please, wherever you found the podcast, leave a review. Very helpful to help other people find the work. And also, if you have not, please go check out the trading course, marketlifetrading.com. Thank you very much. I'll see you back for another episode very soon.
Well, it's never hard